Well, welcome.
Thanks.
The first question I just wanted to ask about your journey to becoming a U.S. journalist covering China for the New York Times. If you could just talk about how you came there.
Well, I've been at the Times since '98, and I had, before I became a journalist, I had a China background. I studied Chinese in college, and then I was an English teacher there in the late '80s. And then in 2008, China was kind of gearing up for the Olympics, and at that time there was a lot of unrest. There was some rioting in Tibet, and then there was an earthquake in Sichuan. So they needed some extra bodies, and originally I went temporarily, and I was asked to go temporarily, but then it sort of became a kind of a long-term thing. It was just a kind of a coincidence of my having a China background, I guess you could say.
Cool. So if you were there in the late '80s, did the revolts at that time sort of have an impact on you? And
Sure. Yeah, I was in a city called Wuhan, which is kind of central China, and there were protests in that city, and my students, everyone left the campus and went down to the train tracks, or the bridge that connects the north and the south of China. There's one bridge, there was then, and they blocked those tracks for a few days and paralyzed basically transportation across the country, which is amazing to think now that you can just block one bridge. And anyway, so they did that until the kind of army cracked down in Beijing, and then everyone kind of got word and fled. So that was kind of a direct impact in terms of my students. But and then of course I had to leave because most foreigners at that time were urged to leave because the U.S. Washington thought there would be a civil war. There was a brief period where we thought there'd be some bloodshed, more bloodshed. So I left, made my mother happy.
yeah. Well, City of Asylum, of course, is concerned about censorship in China, so I have a few questions about that for you. Just to start it off, I understand that you had some problems with your email correspondence while you were working in China. Can you share that story with us?
Well, it's quite common actually, but I was I was at the time using Yahoo, which I don't advise anyone using Yahoo. And they somehow went into my mail my options and put in a strange address to forward all my correspondence, and I didn't. And no reason to go in there and look, so I didn't know for I don't know how long, for months or years, all my emails were being forwarded to some strange address. But I think we've all long since assumed that our emails are being read in China, and we don't do anything. And I didn't then, and I don't now. I don't read anything that's going to get anyone in trouble. And most of the people, you'd be surprised, Chinese who you correspond with by email don't care if the government knows what they're doing, because they're very out and open. They're not sort of sneaking around. A lot of them are very kind of self-confident and bold in that way. Some you could say foolhardy, but they. So anyway, but we assume that we're all been hacked and they know everything we do anyway.
So there's been some conflicting signs coming out of China, just reading the newspaper about the changing nature of censorship there. I read last week that from Evan Osnos on The New Yorker that there's a new battle over censorship being waged by creatives. I also read that by Paul Moser for the Washington Post about changes to internet searches so that people might not even know when their searches are being censored. And I was reading that about the Zhuling case, the poisoning case, that there was an effort to quash the social media, but it still blossomed anyway. Do you see a sea change coming to censorship in China?
I
Anytime
would
in the
say
near future?
no. I think it's only gotten worse, and I think it's going to get tighter in the near future. I don't know about the long term, but the first two things you mentioned, the second thing you mentioned about the internet searches being tweaked so you don't know you're being. I mean, that's actually a really brilliant innovation of censorship, because what it does is it denies you the awareness that you're being censored, which is really a very insidious thing that's happening in China that I've seen in the last few years, and I think it bodes poorly for Chinese kind of awareness about the outside world, because they just don't know so much, and they're in an internet bubble. The government's created an intranet, like as if you were like at some college and you only could go into university system. I mean,
Mhm.
this is only it's a closed system, and you do searches for certain things, and you'll get nothing. I mean, you'll get some, nonsense,
Right.
but you won't know anything about it. And you go out into the world, and you talk to other people, and that you're not speaking the same language. You don't know. They don't. And I find that with a lot of my Chinese friends and people who are educated and generally aware about the world, and you bring up certain subjects, and they just don't really understand what you're talking about.
Recently, we've seen in the news some legislation and bringing into question the state of freedom of speech in the United States. So the federal investigator seizing phone records at the AP, the case of Stephen Kim revealing the monitoring of James Rosen at Fox News, and then we have the Hedges v. Obama case, which they won in district court about the NDAA legislation. I just want to get your reaction to this news, and I was just wondering, is it overblown, or is this a legitimate concern for journalists in the United States?
I think it's definitely legitimate, and I think that especially the AP stuff. I think it was a bit abusive, and I am alarmed at how far the Obama administration's gone in terms of punishing leakers and all that. That said, I do think it's overblown, but that's largely because of my kind of the relativism that I've
Right.
experienced in being in China, where the government's intentions are purely malicious, and they're not going after terrorists. They're going after people who are thinking and speaking differently
Mhm.
in ways that they feel threatened. And I don't really fear that's happening in our government. We have a really, really solid system of checks and balances. We have a free media. That kind of stuff is not going to happen if we veer too much in that direction. And you see now the reaction, the media reaction, it's very strong, and it will have an impact on that. Our system is malleable and it works, and in China that doesn't exist. So I just don't. So I guess I'm not really alarmed.
Yeah, compared to what you've seen in China.
Yeah.
Relative to that. What about the diplomatic effects? Do you think that the next time U.S. diplomats try to push for greater protection for journalists like yourself in China, that there might be they might use the AP and Fox scandals to accuse them of hypocrisy?
They probably will, but
Mhm.
they use they'll use anything at their disposal to kind of discount any criticism. I mean, human rights for years, their basic line about human rights violations is that they just redefine what human rights are. They just say human rights are the right to eat, the right to shelter. We provide that.
Mhm.
We have a great human rights record. Look at Bill. We provide so many jobs, and everyone's fed and housing. And who are you to criticize about human rights? Look at your homeless rate.
Mhm.
Look at so they can very easily twist the kind of the whole discussion in a way that we can go and argue on about it, but it's really just gibberish in my
Mhm.
humble opinion.
The speakers here today, Chen Guangcheng, Huang Xiang, and Liao Yiwu, they were all here after suffering imprisonment and censorship in China. So I was just wondering, do you have any advice for them if they're trying to communicate with family who are still in China, or other dissidents? What's the best way of going about doing that?
To communicate with them, I mean, they do pretty good. Listen, dissidents in China, for the most part, use proxy software like VPNs and stuff to get over the firewall.
Mhm.
So they're getting the messages loud and clear from these guys, from Chen Guangcheng, Liao Yu. I mean, their writings, their Twitter. I'm not even sure if Liao Yu was on Twitter, but
Mhm.
whatever they're doing social media wise, people in China who are interested and willing to go over the firewall can hear it. I don't know if that answers. Is that what
Yeah.
you were kind of looking for?
Absolutely. So they're already sort of talking.
Yeah, they're already plugged in. That segment of the population that's already kind of committed to taking off the blinders.
Mhm.
They know what's going on. It's just the 99.9% of the rest of the country doesn't really care. Just would rather have a really great weekend shopping and
Yeah.
go to restaurants and stuff. They don't care.
Always did that here too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Except here, I feel like it's maybe 40%,
Right.
whereas in China it's really the vast majority.
This week's Time cover story is examining China's place in the world under the newly installed president. It discusses at length how China views itself as an ancient civilization that was recently embarrassed in its history by the West. Do you see that legacy of oppression by the West playing out in the minds of government officials in China today?
Yeah, it's kind of one of their guiding, uh, I would say, philosophies. I would say it's a device. It's certainly it's true. There was a rough period there where
Mhm.
the West did abuse and subjugate parts of China, um, uh, but that ended in really the 40s. So I mean 1949 for sure. Japanese were gone way before then. But I think it's become a very convenient tool to rally people and to kind of, it's become a kind of legitimizing force for the Communist Party. I mean, because if you think back, I mean, look with the same period, our enemies, the Japanese, the Germans, during the war. I mean, we've certainly got past that, and we've, done great things together. And I think to continue to demonize the West for that period, when most people who are around then are dead, it's just a very blatant kind of tool.
Right, so it's sort of like an ideological or philosophical form of propaganda where
Yeah.
you're controlling the way people think about a certain.
Yeah, and the problem is it's not yes, it's propaganda, but it's also become absorbed
Internalized.
Yeah, and I think a lot of otherwise very intelligent, rational people, Chinese leaders included, believe that the West is essentially hostile to China. That the U.S. Is dedicated to containing China's rise.
Right.
And I don't, I don't subscribe to that. I don't think the U.S. is. We're not interested in containing China. If China just wants to become a very economically powerful, country, we're not interested in containing that. There's other things we're perhaps containing, but that is about not following international norms and certainly the established kind of system of morality and ethics that we have in the West. Yeah.
So there seems to be a tension there between the business interests in China and the growing economy, and sort of the censorship and the current or the old regime. So I'm wondering, like, if there's a market for a certain kind of material to be published, then there's money to be made there. How long can government stand in the way?
Well, the thing is, there's plenty of ways to make money with non-political things. There's, if you want to just look at movies, I mean, look at Hollywood. What we produce here is mostly just apolitical entertainment and blockbusters and action and drama, and you can do that. And I think with certain limitations, the thing in China is you can't. There's a lot of movies you can't make. You can't make kind of homicidal maniac films. You can't make zombie films. You can't make world coming to the end films that touch on evil, corrupt governments, things like that, because it all makes the Communist Party nervous. So there is limitations on how that affects creative output, and there are a lot of frustrated filmmakers in China who this whole areas are untouchable, like time travel. You can't even do time travel as a theme because it could take you back to another time that is potentially dangerous for the Communist Party to explore. But so the short answer is, I think basically there's plenty of money to be made, and they've channeled into certain acceptable themes and topics. But in the end, I do, and I think that's what I'm going to talk about today. And when I give this my little talk, is that I think China's policy is actually harming it in the long run in terms of damaging both its cultural capital and also its kind of international soft power and its image around the world, and ultimately it's going to hurt the party.
A lot of the genres you name, apocalyptic zombie movies or action movies with homicidal maniacs, those are some of the highest grossing films here in the United States. So if there is money perceivably to be made there in those kind of films, do you think that there's going to be a push from the business interests to be allowed to sort of show those films in China?
Well, what's happening, it's quite insidious, is that so China only lets in 34 foreign films a year, but it doesn't have any restrictions on collaborative or co-productions where where a Hollywood studio and a Chinese state-run filmmaking entity will team up, and there's no limitation on that. So what happens is they get a Chinese partner and they make a film, but they let the Chinese dictate some of the content. So they remove like some things that are threatening, like the new Brad Pitt film, the Z World War
World War
Z.
Z, yeah.
Right. Originally, that film, it's about zombies and there's a virus, and originally the virus began in China. That's just a line in the movie.
Mhm.
The Chinese objected to that, and they've taken that out. So now the virus no longer begins in China. I don't know what country they've named. Probably North Korea, something absurd. But I think that's that's kind of what we're seeing now is the Hollywood, is so eager for the film in China, Chinese moviegoers' money that they're willing to basically bend the kind of creative independence, artistic independence to sort of satisfy the Chinese government.
So rather than the government bending, it's more the creatives who are having to bend.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
Chinese government doesn't bend.
I want to talk a little bit about sort of the art of journalism and how your experience has been over there in China as a journalist. So I think reporting in China requires even more finesse when cultivating sources than maybe otherwise. Chen Guangcheng, the Chinese human rights lawyer who's here today, I know that you tried to meet with him briefly when he was under house arrest. Can you talk about that experience, and is that a reflection sort of as your experience as a whole?
No, that was unusually dramatic.
Mhm.
Normally, you don't get attacked by an old man with a broom and kind of roughed up by thugs. Now, that was unusual, and it speaks to it's the way that Chinese are treated. That's not unusual. Chinese dissidents are treated brutally and unspeakable torture, but for journalists usually are insulated from that because they recognize it makes really bad kind of footage, and which it did. It made great for me, but bad for the Chinese government. So generally, you go to a place and the most they can do is just kind of block you from going somewhere very politely, and they can stop your car, and they can make the people you want to interview kind of not there conveniently. But for the most part, it's remarkably free. A lot of the reporting I do is pretty unhindered. Often it's because I also become good at it in terms of, turning off your phone, taking out the SIM card, not checking into hotels until the end of the day. So because every time you check into a hotel, you have to give over your passport, which goes immediately to the Public Security Bureau, so they know you're there. So there's ways that you can kind of minimize your contact with the public security folks, but generally, I have to say it's fairly free for a foreign journalist in China.
Well, Mr. Chen was eventually able to escape his house arrest, very dramatic fashion, and make it to the U.S. Embassy. How did that affect U.S. diplomacy with China at a time when we were trying to sort of build a stronger connection for support in Syria and North Korea?
I think it was it was a pretty big bump at the time. Hillary Clinton had just happened to arrive. I mean, the timing was just unbelievable. And so, she was negotiating with China's top kind of diplomat. But it was temporary. I think it was very temporary, and I think the U.S.-China relationship is pretty strong. It is not easy to derail, and neither side really wants it to derail. And perhaps it's a bit of a problem in that the U.S. is so keen for it not to derail that it's not going to push for certain things that I think with other nations it would push for. Certain like human rights and the cyber hacking, for example.
Right.
Things that I think are quite serious, but you don't hear the administration talking too loudly about these things.
Right. So, like you said, the cyber hacking, the internet is key to free expression in China, and you said it's under tight control. You wrote recently about a citizen journalist, Mr. Zhu, or Zhu, I'm sorry, I'm not good with the names, Zhu, yeah, who was on a one-man mission to expose corruption in government. You said in your article that Chinese citizens have come to rely on the internet and netizens as a form of retribution. Do you see a growing presence for citizen journalists in China, and how has it changed the landscape for traditional journalists?
It's a mixed bag. There definitely are citizen journalists who get their stuff out there, but it also depends on who their target is, and if it's a fairly high level official, it's not going to get very far. It's going to get zapped off the internet. What this guy Mr. Zhu does is he targets fairly low level officials, and they don't have enough juice to kind of pull the plug on it. Where once it gets way out there on the internet, it's spread. You need some pretty good connections at the Chinese internet companies, because they're the ones that do the censoring. It's not actually the government.
Okay.
The Chinese internet companies have this kind of agreement with the government that they do the censoring, because if they don't do the censoring, they're going to get in big trouble. So, anyway, so there is a certain kind of bandwidth in which citizen journalists can do their thing, but it's not that broad, and it's getting narrower. I feel in the last, I feel like in the last few months it's gotten narrower, and the way it affects mainstream
Right.
journalists, I think it puts pressure on them to do stuff of substance, and I think there are a lot of frustrated Chinese journalists, and I'm friendly with quite a few, and who are committed to this thing called journalism, which is in the West is we're meant to kind of monitor and tell the truth, and we're supervising, prescribing kind of force, and in China, and according to the Chinese Communist Party, the journalism is to serve the interests of the party, and they don't hide that fact. That's just what you're there for. So Chinese journalists are always trying to find sort of the middle ground there, where they can do what they feel they tell the truth,
Right.
and also not get in trouble and lose their job. So it's very frustrating.
So you see the internet sort of shrinking in its capacity to allow for this citizen journalist to.
I mean, I think there's like a bit of a pendulum in
Mhm.
China, and I think it goes back and forth, and the netizens always find ways to get around it, and the government sort of comes up with new ways to curtail, and then maybe there's a little bit of a thaw politically at the top, and I just haven't, since 2008, I haven't seen much of a thaw, and everyone thought with with the Olympics, because there was kind of an opening up before the Olympics, because China had promised, when they were awarded the Olympics, that was one of the things they promised to do, is to kind of open up the internet and allow protests and do all the things that we, Western liberal democracies allow. But in fact, they didn't really do that. They faked it a bit, and they opened up the internet a little bit. But after that, you had all the Arab Spring stuff happening in Tunisia, and that freaked them out.
Yeah.
And since then, it's been a pretty steady closing up, and the new leader, Xi Jinping, people thought maybe things would get better, but so far he's been in power since November, and there's the one concrete thing we've seen is that there's a protest movement to get officials to declare their wealth publicly, this asset disclosure thing, and the people who've championed that and have been detained and charged with serious crimes. So there's not a lot of optimism at the moment.
So the internet can sort of be a tool of domestic control in China. Now there's also concern about it being a tool of sort of international control, or like a sort of a weapon. There's been concern from the U.S. administration that China is a major source of cyber espionage and cyber terrorism. Do you have any indication of whether these attacks are coming from officials or individual hackers?
Well, it's not like there's one building. I mean, there's been reports about this building in Shanghai. It's not really just one building where they're just all sitting there. There's a whole kind of ecosystem of some other just freelancers who just do their own thing, who are patriotic and may want to decide to attack websites of Tibetan organizations abroad, exile groups. And then there's also freelancers who are contracted by the government to kind of do certain things and gather things. And also companies, you can hire a hacker if you're a company. If you're solar panel manufacturer, I'm just throwing this example out.
Right.
You can, and you want to get the latest technology, you can hire a team to go in and mine some foreign American solar researcher company. I don't know. You get download stuff from them, and then there are also the People's Liberation Army (PLA) also has a large hacking operation, and the problem is we don't really know.
Yeah.
The things we don't really know, so it's very speculative, but I don't doubt it's at many different levels it's happening.
Okay. Do you think that the threat of sort of cyber terrorism will allow any other governments to sort of tighten their restrictions on their internet and freedom of expression? Is that a concern for you, that sort of the threat of other countries using the internet will allow them to sort of
I think
secure?
I'm not a technology guy, but
Yeah.
My guess is that it's about security kind of safeguards. It's about setting up certain kinds of firewalls. That it's not about limiting the kinds of discussion that people have about politics and
Right.
any number of subjects. It's just about internet security. So I think we need to figure out a way in the U.S. certainly about how to remove the back doors and the weaknesses we have in our system. I don't think it should be an excuse. I'm sure countries will use that,
Right.
but I don't necessarily worry about it now.
Okay. Well, I know you're both a journalist, but you're also a storyteller, and you've done documentaries in the past. I feel like your articles often make use of a compelling individual or an event to sort of speak to a larger issue, and it makes the reader feel invested in that particular issue. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of a journalist as a storyteller to not only inform but also engage the public in important issues.
Oh, I never thought about that. Well, I mean, yeah, I think we as human beings, we to kind of get into a complicated subject, we require some empathy, and we have to
Mhm.
kind of relate to another human being. So I always just naturally try to, just kind of find a person to just initially get you into the story,
Right.
so you connect with that person. But I think I don't know. I guess I've always had a weakness for like just the underdog and the little guy. So I'm
Mhm.
drawn to those kind of characters, and then I try to use them to tell like bigger stories, geopolitical or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a tension there between the objectivity of a journalist and sort of the humanism of a storyteller, where you want to capture the whole picture, but you also want to tell the story of an individual?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, but even by deciding who you choose, you're giving up a tiny bit of objectivity, because
Mhm.
because I could focus on I could do a story about a mass murderer, and kind of focus on what a great dad he is, and
Right.
look, he makes really great paintings, and it's just by choosing who you choose, you're obviously saying something about your belief system and point of view. But I try to balance as much as I can. It's hard in China because there's no other side to talk to.
Mhm.
The government doesn't officials won't talk to the foreign media. So in the States, there's always, when you have a story about someone, maybe there's some tension, there's some controversy, you have some kind of activist in your story, and you'll always be able to get the other side, that whether it be a corporation or a local government that is, if the guy you're focusing on says he's being, treated poorly, you can always call a local police department, and they'll get their side of the story,
Mhm.
and so you get some balance, and I think but it's very hard in China. No one returns your calls, no one answers your faxes, so it's almost impossible to get that other side of the story.
So we're trying to tell the whole story when you have to rely on a small number of sources. It makes it especially difficult in China.
Yeah, and China does that to its own kind of its own disadvantage.
Right.
It hurts itself.
Mhm. If you were able to quote a official source in your article along with a citizen or a concerned citizen, they might provide a little bit more of the voice of the Chinese
Yeah.
government.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you
Sure.
for your wonderful reporting out of China
Thanks.
and all that you do. Thank you.
Thanks.